It was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history, and now a truck driver who stormed into a Pittsburgh synagogue and killed 11 Jewish worshipers has been found guilty. The jury now deliberating over his punishment, and he could be sentenced to death. James DeSimone is an LA civil rights attorney and joins us now live to talk more about this. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Good morning, Josh. Nice to see you.
Good morning. So first off here, a lot of people have said that this was essentially a foregone conclusion that he was going to be found guilty. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have to agree with that. I mean, one, the nature of the testimony. I mean, you have a woman who was the last witness who comes in and says, as her arm is being blown off by these high-powered assault rifles, that she's watching her 90-year-old mother die. I mean, and points out the shooter as the person who did it. I mean, you can't get more direct testimony of murder than that. But in this instance, you had the defense who came in and admitted that he shot these people. There was no doubt about it. So, yes, conviction was a foregone conclusion. The hate crime was something that was contested. But of course, I mean, the hate crime just seemed open and obvious here, given the prior statements and given the nature of shooting up and killing all these people worshiping in a synagogue.
And so the jury is now going to deliberate to determine if he's going to be sentenced to death. Predictions are that it could take weeks of deliberations. Is that a normal length of time in a case like this one?
The jury's not ready to deliberate yet. Deliberations are, of course, when all the evidence is in and they go back and they speak privately, and we're never privy to those discussions. They're not videotaped. We hear what they have to say after the trial, but we don't really know what goes on there, right? But what you're going to have here, which is unusual, is 6 weeks of more evidence coming in, both on aggravating and mitigating circumstances, to determine whether the death sentence is appropriate.
Is it standard for the jury to be the ones to determine whether a person is sentenced to death, and does the judge have to go with the jury's decision there down the line?
Well, absolutely. I mean, all of us as Americans, even murderers, enjoy a Seventh Amendment right, the constitutional right to a jury trial. So the shooter here, Mr. Bowers, has a right to a jury trial. My read of Pennsylvania law is that, yes, the judge, the trial judge, does have to impose the sentence that the jury decides. So if that jury imposes death, the judge has to say, yes, it's a death sentence, because that's what the jury decided. But it is then taken up to reviewing courts. It's even taken to the governor. And the governor, of course, can commute a death sentence. So there are levels of review. But that trial judge, if that jury says a death sentence, he's going to impose the death sentence.
What factors go into the jury's decision when you are talking about a sentence of death? Obviously, life in prison is one possibility there, but when you're talking about death, I imagine it's a little more serious.
Well, absolutely. I mean, keep in mind that, you know, it's so serious that no one has actually been put to death in Pennsylvania since 1999. There's over 100 people on death row. But for a variety of reasons, there's actually a moratorium. Still, prosecutors think that it's important to have the death sentence imposed. Things can change. We see how the political winds change, and maybe people will be sentenced to or actually put to death in Pennsylvania. However, what the jury looks at is a series of what are called aggravating factors and mitigating factors. So the fact here that the crime was committed in the commission of a felony and that so many people were impacted are aggravating factors, and you're going to hear weeks of victims' testimony, including those who lived. 5 law enforcement officers were seriously injured when they came to rescue those people in the synagogue. You're also going to hear what are called mitigating factors, and they're going to look at this person's mental health history. There's been suggestions that he suffers from schizophrenia, from epilepsy, a brain disease, and that he was basically manipulated by these right-wing extremist sites that paint Jews and others as causing the problems of America. And it really, you know, it points out the danger of all of us having computers and having access to this information, and someone who perhaps is mentally ill getting manipulated. But I don't think that those mitigating factors here will overcome the aggravating factors of the heinousness of the crime and how many people it implicated here, or how many people were injured here. You know, I'm not a big believer in the death penalty, honestly, but given the factors here, I wouldn't be surprised if the jury imposed a death penalty.
All right, and this is obviously considered to be a hate crime because you're talking about 11 Jewish worshipers that were targeted here. Does that change anything about the legal process overall and how all of this plays out?
Well, I think it absolutely does. I mean, one, it is that additional felony that is an aggravating factor. A hate crime is a felony, so it goes towards the death sentence. But really, you're looking towards the motive of the shooter here and how he targeted individuals because of their religious beliefs. And look, any murder is obviously wrong. But when an individual comes into innocent people in a house of worship and uses an assault weapon to basically massacre them, the heinousness of that crime, where it's just because of these individuals' religious beliefs, I think it's something that touches all of us because we all have our beliefs. We all have the hurdles we've overcome in life. And if someone is going to take that characteristic of a person and use that as an excuse for committing murder, it's something that should be explored in the legal process. And we as a society have to look at the type of messages that are being sent out and seeing how we can counterbalance them so that people are not so manipulated into hating fellow Americans and fellow human beings.
What happens next in this case here? We know that the jury is there'll be some more evidence, and then they will deliberate on the actual sentence there. So what is the next step in all of this?
The evidence starts June 26th, so the prosecutors will go first. They'll start putting on the witnesses who are alive and the family members of the deceased to show the impact on these families and the aggravating factors. And then the defense will have the opportunity to introduce evidence of Mr. Bauer's mental health history and any other mitigating factors that would go to say, hey, spare this guy's life because this wasn't something he consciously did. He had a mental illness that drove this. And we'll see which of those narratives win the day in the jury's mind after 6 weeks of that testimony. And then they have as much time to deliberate as they need to reach a just and fair decision.
And if he is sentenced to death, I imagine it would be a while before he is actually put to death. As you mentioned, this isn't something that has happened in a while there. So it would probably be a while that he would be on death row. I don't know if that gives him enough time to make an appeal or how that works.
Well, his appeal is automatic. I mean, in death sentence cases take so long because it's a death sentence. The state has an obligation. He's being represented by public defenders now. There will be appellate specialists that are also paid by the state to deal with that appeal and to file that appeal on his behalf. So yes, it will be years. I mean, it will be, look, if no one has been put to death since 1999, the truth of the matter is it's unlikely that Mr. Bowers will be put to death still, as something to show how much that we condemn these types of criminal activity. The prosecutors felt that going after the death penalty was important. Remember, his attorney said that he would agree to a life sentence, plead guilty to a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors said no, given the nature of this crime, we want to go for the death sentence.
All right, James, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. Is there anything else that you want to add before we let you go?
Well, just my heart goes out to all those individuals who were praying that day and who suffered the worst of harms. And, this is in the United States of America. I would just hope that we're coming to a time when instead of there's a division, that we bring people together and respect all of Americans and all of the people who just live in our country as people, as human beings, and stop the demonization of each other.
All right. Thank you again for taking the time to join us. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Josh. Have a great day.
You too.